Good afternoon. I'm told that we're live. Thank you all for signing in today. This is, as I understand it, the first experiment in an RZA program of video conferencing as a means of continuing education. Today is the yahrzeit of Elisa. She was murdered. She died 24 years ago today. It's a day of mixed blessings for us because Elisa, while she's not here, continues to be the religious and spiritual leader of our family. Now, you might think that we're doing this because of the events of April 1995, and I have to be frank with you, we're really not. We're doing it because of the events that began in August of 1979, when Elisa was 4.5 years old and getting ready to attend kindergarten. I was working in the city at that time as a young lawyer. Now I'm an old lawyer. And Roz called me, my wife Roz called me in the office, and she said, "What time are you coming home?" And I said, "What's going on?" And she told me that your daughter is driving me crazy. Now, we had two girls at the time, Elisa, who was 4.5, and Gail, who was 2.5. Gail was 2.5. When I heard the emphasis on your daughter, I knew that it was Elisa who was driving her crazy. When I returned home from work that day, we sat down in the den after dinner, and I asked Elisa what was going on, and she looked at me and she looked at her mother with her big brown eyes, and she said, "Where am I going to kindergarten next month?" Now, she was a bright girl. She knew I had taken a day off in June, and I brought her around the corner to the public school in West Orange, the Pleasantdale School. And Elisa stood on the other side of the counter and told the lady that her name was SFlatow, that she lived on Dale Drive, and what her date of birth was, and what her phone number was, and who her mother and father were. So I reminded her that she was going to the Pleasantdale School. Well, she looked at me, and she looked at her mother, and she looked back at me, and she said, "No, I'm not. I'm going to a Jewish school with my friend Becky, and Mommy has to call Becky's mommy tonight to find out about it because I'm not going to the Pleasantdale School." She then turned around and walked out of the room. Now, we were young parents in 1979, and we knew you didn't take marching orders from a 4-year-old. So Roz waited until the next day before she called Becky's mommy. And 2 days after that, I'm taking a tour of a modern Orthodox yeshiva, in those days called the Hebrew Youth Academy of Essex County. Today it's grown into the Joseph Kushner Hebrew Academy. And we're taking a tour of the facility, and Rabbi Wally Green, who was the principal of the school at the time, is extolling the virtues of a day school education, telling us what the kids are going to learn and how they're going to learn. He pointed out that the Hebrew subjects were given in the morning when the kids were alert, and after lunch, when the carbs kicked in, that's when they would do the English subjects. So we got back to his office, and he said, "Do you have any questions?" And the first question I asked him, "What was this going to cost?" And he showed me the tuition contract between $1,800 and $2,000. Now, of course, when I give that number to a parent who is educating a child in the yeshiva or a day school system today, parents who are paying $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 per year per kid, their eyes light up. "Oh, wish I could pay that." And I have to remind them that when Elisa started yeshiva, I was making all of $25,000 a year. So yeshiva tuitions continue to be, unfortunately, the best form of Jewish birth control. Second question I asked him was something that was going through my mind as we walked through the halls of HYA, because, you know, Roz and I always lit Shabbos candles Friday night. Then we'd go out to dinner. Saturday morning, I'd like to bond with my daughters. Well, we didn't call it bonding in 1970. We called it going to the hardware store. Bonding is a new age name for getting together with your kids. And in the mornings, I'd bond with them. In the afternoon, Roz would bond with them at the mall. I said to Rabbi Green, I said, "If I send Elisa to this yeshiva, will my lifestyle change?" Well, he looked at me and leaned forward on his desk, and he said, "No." I'm fond of saying that Rabbi Green lied, but not completely. You see, I actually asked him the wrong question. A yeshiva, our institutions, are really nothing more than buildings. It's what takes place in the building that one day makes your daughter come home and say to you, "Daddy, dinner's over, we have to bench." And she had to explain to me that benching was Birkat HaMazon. I went across the street to a neighbor and asked her what a bencher was, and she gave me these velveteen, torn benches with soup stains on them from weddings that they had been to. We came home, and Lisa taught us how to bench. Much to my pleasant surprise, the State of Israel was a regular part of the yeshiva curriculum. When you walk into a yeshiva today, a modern Orthodox yeshiva, at least today, you'll see posters about Israel, pictures of Chayalim, pictures of the Kinneret, the Dead Sea, Yerushalayim, of course, Tel Aviv. And they just simply encourage kids to be proud of Israel and be part of Israel. I'll never forget that kindergarten year. She came home one day and she said, "Daddy, you have to come to school next week because it's Yom HaAtzmaut. We're going to have a party." I said, "Yom what?" And she said, "Ha'atzmaut, Ha'atzmaut." Now, she couldn't describe it to me what it really was, and it was only until the Shabbos Bulletin came home, and it explained that Yom HaAtzmaut is Israel's Independence Day, and there's going to be a gala party in the school that Wednesday night, and we could come and see our kids' Yom HaAtzmaut Israel projects and enjoy Israeli food. So RZA and I got in the old Buick, and we went to Academy, HYA, and there was the Israel Fair for Yom HaAtzmaut. You could see various types of kotels made out of sugar cubes, and as the kids got older, they made them out of different items, of course, but lots of kotels on display. But it was that night that I learned that Israelis invented ziti and pizza, because that's what they served. That was the Israeli food. Elisa actually made 6 trips in her short life to Israel. She went first when she was 11 with my sister for 2 weeks, and she came home and I picked her up at Kennedy Airport. Her first words to me were not, "Look at this great t-shirt I got you, this is Coca-Cola in Hebrew." They were, "When can I go back again?" She went back for the second time on a summer program for 6 weeks with National Council of Young Israel, and that was a hiking and schlepping and climbing type of tour. When she came back, I think she slept for 24 hours straight. But the third trip that she took, the one that I think would influence her forever, the remainder of her short life, was in her senior year at the Frisch School. It was March of the Living. Now, we may be familiar with March of the Living because of our associations, but I will be honest with you, when I travel around the country telling this story, there are parents who have never heard of March of the Living. And I try to explain to them that what it is, it's a 2-week trip. Your teenage, silly daughter goes away, and she comes back a proud young Jewish woman. And I tell them that the first week is spent in Poland, and she's on a bus one day, and she sees buildings that have Hebrew writing written along the roof lines, buildings that used to be yeshivas or hospitals that are now police barracks, office buildings, things like that. And of course, she's in Poland. She has to go to the camps. And she has to go to Medanik, and she goes to Treblinka. And then Yom HaShoah, they take these 2,000 students from the diaspora and they bring them to the gate of Auschwitz, the gate that mocks you, that says, "Work shall make you free." And they're standing there in their blue slickers, and many of them are holding Israeli flags, and it's very quiet. And the council of the leaders tell them to turn around, because now we're going to march down the road. And they march about 2 kilometers or so through the gates of the extermination camp that was Birkenau. Auschwitz had this aura that it was a work camp, and Birkenau had no such aura. It was there simply to exterminate Jews. And because she's been in Poland now for a week, she knows human ash when she sees it in an oven that is there on display. And she's given a little yahrzeit candle, and she's told to light it and say Kaddish with her friends, and they do. But after the last Domain, unlike 1.5 million Jews who went through those same gates at Birkenau, she's allowed to leave. And she eventually gets back to the airport, and the airplane flies them to Tel Aviv. And as soon as she lands at Ben Gurion Airport and they come down the steps, she notices that she's totally someplace different, because Poland was dank and it was gray and drab, and the people walk with their heads down. And maybe that's Hashem's way of saying, this is because of what your ancestor did during the Shoah. But now she sees that the sky is clear blue and the sun is already warm early in the morning. And she begins her tour for the second week in Israel. One morning, the bus that she's on pulls over to the curb, and the counselor tells them, "Everybody off the bus, stand on the sidewalk, but don't walk away." And they do. And as they're standing there looking around, they see that a taxi cab has stopped, and the driver and the passenger are standing by open doors, and a private automobile stops, and the driver has gotten out. And people start coming out of the shops, and they're standing on the sidewalk. Suddenly, a siren starts to scream, because that morning is Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Day of Remembrance. And in the afternoon, after the sirens have stopped their crying, Elisa goes to Har Herzl. And she can read Hebrew, and she's in the military cemetery, and she sees the graves of Chayalim who have died defending the state of Israel, in fact, defending us. And she notices their age, 18 years old, 19 years old, 20 years old. And there are parents standing alongside these graves, parents who are her parents' age, or maybe just a little bit older. That afternoon is spent in more contemplation, and they're studying more about the history of Israel and what the state of Israel means to the Jewish people. But, in our tradition, the evening brings a new day. And the new day in Israel is also welcomed. It's welcomed with fireworks over the old city, because that next day is Yom Ha'atzmaut. And kids are dancing with each other in the streets, spraying themselves with that silly string confetti that comes out of cans. And when your daughter comes out of her hotel the next morning, she says that every car has a flag flying from it, and every merpeset, every balcony has a flag hanging from it. And people are in the streets, and they're happy, and they're laughing, and they're dressed up, because it's like a Yom Tov, Yom Ha'atzmaut. And that afternoon, in contrast to the previous day, she's at picnics, and she's at barbecues, and they're playing soccer, and they're having fun. Your daughter eventually returns, and she doesn't talk a lot about March of the Living. It's actually too hard for her to talk about, for her to digest. But Elisa had changed. She changed because it was the way she began to act in the house and around us. We sent away a teenager, as I said before, and a proud young Jewish woman returned. All of a sudden, Elisa announced to me one day that she wants to volunteer at the Russian Day School. That's what we call the school that had been set up in the Metro West Jewish community to accommodate the Russian students who were coming in from the former Soviet Union. And she wanted to volunteer, she says to me, and I asked her, I said, what are you going to do, teach them English? She says, no, they're in America, they have to learn how to play baseball. That fall, when Elisa went away to Brandeis University, she calls me up to tell me that she's now the Shabbos meal coordinator in the kosher dining room. I said, Shabbos meal coordinator, what does that mean? And she explained to me that Friday night, they have about 250 students for Shabbos meals, and same thing, Shabbos lunch, maybe a little bit less. And she's in charge of coordinating everything. And all I can think of is that the girl that we had to bribe or threaten to help set our Shabbos table for 7 is volunteering to serve a table for 250. We found out that she was tutoring nearby in Newton kids who were getting ready for the bar mitzvah lessons. And I would ask Elisa more than once to help her sisters and brother with their Hebrew subjects. And she said to me, no, they have to learn on their own. She was making volunteer phone calls for our federation up in the Boston area. She was volunteering at a senior citizen center. In fact, she was just simply getting involved in the Jewish world, the Jewish community. Elisa's 6th trip to Israel began in January 1995. Unlike many of her friends and indeed her siblings, she didn't want to do a gap year program in Israel. She felt that the gap year program was too constrained, that you had to be on too set of a schedule, and she wanted to do a lot of independent learning. So to her credit, she crammed 3 years at Brandeis into 2.5, and they got a leave of absence. She found a small school to attend in yeshiva, Nishmat. And Nishmat is now not a small school anymore. It's a large school. And she began her studies. She was living in an apartment with several other girls. The number of girls fluctuated with the season. But she loved her independence. She loved taking 2 buses to get to Nishmat in the morning, because she could also then take a bus to go to the kotel. She could take a bus to go to the shuk. She can go to a gym that she found, and she could also run in the streets. A couple of weeks before she died, I had gotten an email from Elisa telling me that she wanted to know if there was money in her bank account. Translate that to, Dad, put money in my bank account, because she wanted to go to Petra in Jordan with 2 of her friends. And then she typed out, I love America, because that was always my shtick, and it still is my shtach today to my daughters when things are going in their favor. And I transferred some money, and I kind of forgot about it until Saturday night, April the 8th, when Elisa called from Yerushalayim, about 11:30 our time, and she said, I'm off for vacation. I said, where are you going again? And she said to me, Gush Katif. I said, what happened to Petra? And she explained that, thanks for the money, Dad, but my friends didn't have a Bank of Dad to go to, so we decided to go to Gush Katif. And I realized I didn't know what Gush Katif was or where it was. So I asked her, and she said Gaza. And I thought for a second that this girl has to be crazy. But I didn't yell at her. I didn't prohibit her from going to Gaza, even though Palestinians were attacking Jews and they were killing each other as well. I had given Elisa 3 rules to travel by when she was in Israel. The first rule was that when you leave Jerusalem, I want you to take public transportation. I don't want you hitchhiking. Second rule is that when you leave Jerusalem, I want you to travel with 1 or more friends. And the third rule was when you travel, I want you going to a recognized destination. I don't want you to tell me that you're camping out under the stars at night in the Negev desert. So I said, Elisa, how are you getting to Gush Katif? And she explained to me that one of the reasons why she was calling us at her 6 o'clock in the morning was that they were catching a bus from the Tachana Markazit down to Ashkelon, and there they were taking another bigger bus into Gush Katif. I said, who are you traveling with? And she told me that she was going with 2 American girls. One was her roommate, one was a girl she had never known. And the third reason was, what's so special about Gush Katif? And she explained to me that they had a hotel that catered to the religious, and there was separate swimming in the Mediterranean for men and women. And she wanted to get a suntan before Pesach, which was in a few days. Now, to say that Elisa loved the sun, I think would be an understatement. I found out that as soon as she got to Israel in January, she went to the shuk and she bought one of those folding beach chairs, the 3-part beach chair, and it's made out of vinyl straps. And every night she would sit in it and bounce up and down to stretch out the straps so that when the spring came around, she could actually sit outside in it comfortably. So rather than scream at Elisa and tell her she couldn't go to Gush Katif, I said, have a good trip. Call us when you get back to Jerusalem on Wednesday. And I hung up the phone. Roz turned to me from the other side of the kitchen. She said, you forgot to get the name of the hotel that Elisa's staying at. And for some reason, I still don't know to this very day, I just answered her and said, don't worry, if something happens, we'll know about it. Sunday morning came. It was an ordinary day in my house. I was late for shul. I ran through the house, down through the basement, through the garage, and I actually took her car out and pulled it into the street, and I turned on the radio. First item of news that I heard that morning was that there'd been a bus bombing in the Gaza Strip. And I'm not sitting here before you telling you that I heard the sound of the explosion, because I didn't. I'm not here to sit here in front of you and tell you I heard the sound that metal makes when it's ripped off the frame of a bus, and I didn't hear anybody's cries of pain. But I knew at that split second that Elisa was involved, and only Hashem could take care of her now. So as to not alarm my wife and the other kids who were in the house, I continued to shul, and we started davening, and 15 minutes later, the phone rang. Now, I knew it was for me, so I went to pick it up, and it was Roz on the other end of the line. Excuse me. Roz was on the other end of the line telling me she'd just gotten off the phone from the mother of one of Elisa's traveling companions. Her bus had been bombed. Her friends were back in Jerusalem, but they didn't know where Elisa was. They had been separated at the scene of the attack. I took off my talis and my tefillin, I put them on a chair, and I went home. And Roz said, who are we going to call? And, you know, Sunday is like Monday workday in Israel, so I tried calling the Israeli consulate in New York City. And the phone was busy, and I hung up, and I redialed it again, and I redialed it again, and it was still busy. So I went back to the phone book, and I found the number for the United States State Department in Washington, D.C. And I called that number, and much to my surprise, the phone was picked up on the first ring. I explained to the operator that my daughter had been involved in a terror attack in Israel. And his only answer to me was, hang on 1 second, please. And he switched me to another extension. And there the operator asked me for Elisa's full name, her passport number, where she was living in Jerusalem, who she was traveling with, where she was going. And they said, we'll call you back. When I hung up that phone, 2 men from the shul saw me leave in such haste that they came over right away. And I told them what was going on. And, you know, we Americans, we're so proud of our Israeli connections, how tenuous they might even really be. And one fellow had a job with a defense contractor here in the States, and he had contacts in the defense ministry in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, and he said he's going to call over there and find Elisa. Other fellow had contacts in the health ministry, and he said he was going to call his contacts in Jerusalem to find out where Elisa was. And the State Department beat everybody to it. The embassy in Tel Aviv located Elisa in a hospital I never heard of before called Soroka Medical Center. But it's in a city that we have all heard about, and we read about it, especially in the opening chapters of the Torah. It's in Beersheba, the same Beersheba of the Torah. That morning, I spoke to two doctors, and both ended their conversations with me along the lines of, you should come right away. So I got on an airplane with my neighbor, Paul Wolf, and we flew to Tel Aviv that afternoon. Before I got on the plane, a rabbi said to me, bring a book of Tehillim and start reading Tehillim on the flight, because, you never know when God will hear you and God will reverse what's already been destined. But frankly, my friends, I was reading Tehillim and I just felt the words bouncing off the cargo rack above me back onto my head. So I closed the Tehillim and I just stared at the screen in front of me for 10.5 hours until we arrived in Tel Aviv the next morning. And I was the first one off the plane. I was met by customs people at the foot of the stairs. And there were no questions as to what brings you to Israel, or do you have any relatives here? You plan on working here? No, nothing like that at all. They took my passport very somberly, they stamped it, and they turned me over to U.S. Embassy personnel. They put me in a van and we started driving to Beersheba. Now, I'd been to Israel twice before, but never in the southern part of the country. And I never realized how much of a desert Israel is once you get, south of Jerusalem and south of some of the other communities like Beit Shemesh and things like that. And as we were driving towards Beersheba, I look out the window and there were camels on the side of the road. Only place I had seen live camels like that before was in the Bronx Zoo and the Ringling Brothers circus. And there on the road was a Bedouin woman driving a donkey cart. It had car tires on this cart, but it was a donkey pulling it down the street. We finally pulled into Beersheba and we made our way to Soroka Medical Center, and we pulled up and the head of the hospital was waiting for us outside. He was there to usher us in through a large crowd of people. And as I was going through the people, one man grabbed me and he put an envelope in my hand and he said, if you need a place to stay for Pesach, please call me. My number is in here. And I put that envelope in my pocket for a while and I kind of forgot about it. They took me in to see Elisa. She was in an intensive care unit with several beds. She was in the bed in the far left corner. She had not a mark on her, but for a bandage on the back of her head over here. Now, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s. I remember all the great medical shows. But the one that really stuck out, I think, for being a serious drama was Ben Casey. And Ben Casey was a neurosurgeon. And at least once a month on Ben Casey, there was a child lying in the bed, head swathed in bandages, and the father would sit down, squeeze the child's hand, and say, okay, daddy's here. And all of a sudden, the daughter or the boy would open up his or her eyes, or she'd mumble something, or squeeze the father's hand back. And you knew by the end of the TV show that that patient was walking out of the hospital. I sat by Elisa's bedside and I squeezed her hand and I whispered in her ear that everything will be okay, daddy's here. But my friends, there was no squeeze of the hand, there was no opening fluttering of the eyes, nothing was mumbled. When I let her hand fall, it just went limp to the side of the bed. Doctors took me into a side room and they gave me a cup of warm orange soda. And they let that news sink in that Elisa was dead. She was not breathing on her own. When she had been operated on, they discovered that the damage to her brain was too severe. It had been lacerated too much, and they had to declare her dead. I asked them why they couldn't do that yesterday, and tell me that yesterday, and they explained that a medication that they give suppresses normal respiration. You don't breathe on your own when you have this medication in your body, but the medication was now out of her system, and she was not breathing. Well, they let that piece of information sink in for another minute or so, and the head of the hospital looked at me from across this small room, and he says, we have a question for you. So for the second time in 2 days, I knew what was going on, and I simply looked at him and I said, you want our organs for transplant, don't you? He says, yes. He said to me that religious Jews do not donate organs out of a misconception of the halacha. And touching his own chest, and he said, we secular Jews, we don't do it. Will you help? Now, I know what the Mishnah tells us, that he who saves one life in Israel as if he has saved the entire universe. How do you say no to saying 6 universes, to create basically 6 new worlds? But I thought of other things as well that morning. I thought of Elisa had this great ability to ask her friends for names and phone numbers of people in Israel that they knew, and she didn't know. And she would call them up and she'd say, hi, my name's Elisa Flato. So-and-so gave me your name and phone number. Can I come for Shabbos lunch? And you know, in Israel, the answer is always yes. And you want to bring a friend? Do you need us to pick you up, to drop you off? Let us know. I thought also about the people who came to Israel in the late 1940s in the face of a war, and they picked up weapons, and some of them unfortunately died, creating a new country. I thought also of the taxi drivers that would wish you a Shabbat Shalom on a Friday afternoon. I also thought of the parents of the 7 other victims of that attack who were in the process of burying their sons and daughters that morning too. I thought also of people who were studying in yeshivas throughout the country, people who demonstrate to us that our religion, our faith, is still alive and very vibrant after almost 3,800 years. So we said yes. And we brought Elisa back home to be buried in the United States, and we started to sit Shiva for a day and a half because Pesach terminates Shiva. She was buried on a Wednesday. We got up Friday morning. And a few weeks after that, I received an invitation from State of Israel Bonds, United Jewish Appeal, to join their speakers bureaus. And I started traveling around the country talking about our experience. And after a while, I began to question myself, why are you doing this? Why are we running around? Sure, I was active in my community. I was on a planning board. I was on the yeshiva boards. I did different things for the public. Why? Where does this come from? Not just me, but the Jewish community at large. And I know that the Torah tells us, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, righteousness, righteousness thou shalt pursue. But I know the Torah tells us a lot of things, and I needed something more concrete, if that's the right word, something I could put my hands around. And that fall, I found terrific inspiration, if that's the right word, in Parsha Lech Lecha. You know, we read about Avraham had split from his nephew Lot, and we read that there's now a war going on, and Lot is captured by these warring tribes. And a man comes running up to Avraham, who's sitting at the entrance of his tent, and he says, "Your kinsfolk has been taken captive." Avram gets up, gathers a small army, or one man, depending on how you read the Meforshim, and he goes and defeats these warring tribes, and he rescues his nephew Lot. I was telling over that story one day at a speech I was giving in downtown Manhattan, and I said, look, there's the example that we need. Abraham got up to rescue Lot. And Julie Berman, who was in attendance, came over to me afterwards. He said, look what the SFlatow says. And the SFlatow has a totally different take on it. The SFlatow says, don't think they knew it was Lot. The message that the Torah is giving us, according to the SFlatow, and I love it, is that he got up because there was a Jew in trouble. He didn't know who it was. Just a member of his tribe was in trouble. And sure enough, when I think back to the current times, look, when we tried to get the Soviet Jews released, what did we do? We marched, we protested, we boycotted. When it came time to get the Ethiopians into Israel, we raised money by the tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars to get them to Israel. When Israel's in crisis, we raise more money. We go to its aid. We have young men, 19, 18 years old, coming from America to serve in the IDF for 1, 2, 3 years. That's how we learn. We learn from what happened almost 4,000 years ago. Look, when you lose a child, one morning you want to pull the covers over your head. You want to block it out. I know that King Solomon tells us there's nothing new under the sun. But I also realized something too. Out of tragedy, we can learn lessons. As I said before, Elisa's bus, 8 people were murdered. The other kids on the bus, their parents got up from Shiva, and they went to work, and they raised families, and they were still building a country, because Israel, my friends, is still a work in progress. And I realized that I can do the same thing too. I can get back up out of bed. I can start putting one foot in front of the other. I can dust myself off. I could start paying attention to things. I didn't have to hide under those covers. I think what we've learned is that the challenge is to let responsibility fall where it may. And in this case, it fell not only on Islamic Jihad, but a little piece of Hamas too. But the big player in the attack that murdered Elisa was the Islamic Republic of Iran, because they were giving Islamic Jihad about $2 million a year in 1995. They're giving much more now, but $2 million a year in 1995 went a long way. And I think you may know that President Clinton signed a law called the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which allowed American citizens to sue state sponsors of terrorism, and Iran headed the list. So my wife and I, we decided that we were going to go after Iran, and we learned that the bill, however, while it was nice and black and white, had no teeth. So I spent the summer of 1996 with my lawyer, Steve Perlis, in Washington, D.C., lobbying to get the bill changed. I will tell you, the one place you don't want to be in the summertime is Washington, D.C. You think it's muggy in Florida, you think it's muggy in New York City. As soon as you get off the train at 8:30 in the morning in Washington, you feel the humidity just hanging in the air. But we did it. We got the law changed. And as Steve Perlis said to me one day when we got some key sponsors to sign on, I don't know how this happened. I said, Steve, there are angels at work. There are malachim at work. So you bring the Iranians to court, you get a judgment, you wind up fighting against your own government in the courtroom again, public media. You look for allies, you find them wherever you can. You start a scholarship fund to send other children to Israel to do what Elisa was doing and what her sisters and brother did. And you try to begin each day thinking about how I can honor Elisa's memory on a day-to-day basis. I believe in destiny. I believe in Beshert. When Elisa was finishing up her kindergarten year at HYA, she was in a bicycle accident. It was Father's Day, and I was taking a nap, because that's what fathers do on Father's Day, I think. And Gail came running in to tell me that Elisa had been in a bicycle accident, and she was hurt. I went downstairs, and I looked at her foot, and even though I've seen a lot of medical shows, I don't have a medical degree, and I could see it was broken very badly. So I put her in the back of the car. We started driving to St. Barnabas Medical Center nearby in Livingston, and we got to the corner of a major intersection. I came to a red light, and she's in the back moaning and groaning as only a 5-year-old can. And I angled the mirror at her, and I said, Elisa, what's going on? What's wrong? And her answer, her comeback to me was astounding, and she said, Daddy, why do these things happen to me all the time? Okay, when she was 2, she fell off a fence. Actually, Roz let go of her while she was sitting on a fence, and she had scars on her forehead to prove it. A year earlier, she was playing in the background with her sister, and Gail helped her go face forward over a concrete retaining wall, scars over here to show it. So here she is again, her 3rd trip to the ER in 3 years, and I said, Elisa, it was an accident. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You didn't expect Marcy to run over your foot with the bicycle. You're going to be fine. Today, 24 years later, sometimes I hear Elisa's voice in the back of my head saying to me, Daddy, why did this happen to me? And I'll tell you, my friends, I always start out the same way. I always start out by saying, Elisa, there are things that happen that we don't understand. We don't know why we sent you to yeshiva. We don't know why we encourage you to go to Israel over and over and over again. But this much I do know at this time. You were in Israel with the people that you love, in the land that you love, studying the Torah that you love. And this time you were certainly in the right place. And I hope I can find my right place too when the time comes. Thank you for listening.